This is Sirius XM Insight, and you're listening to Tell Me Everything with John Fugelsang.
This is Sirius XM Insight. I'm John Fugelsang. Thank you so much for joining us on this, the 11th of January. It's a real pleasure. I'm John Fugelsang. Thank you so much for joining us. And I'm so pleased to welcome our next guest to the program because I really do admire the work Melissa Reiner does. She is a certified consultant in relationship development intervention and has a master's in special education, but she's kind of come to be known as Hollywood's autism consultant. She is credited as the autism consultant on the top-rated TV show The Good Doctor. And we're in a time now where, thanks to shows like Atypical on Netflix and The A Word, and even the work on Sesame Street, the general public is getting more awareness of ASD than they ever have. Of course, being on the autism spectrum impacts 1 in 68 children here in the U.S. Lots of disinformation, lots of fear, lots of ignorance on the subject, and she has been one of the top autism and behavioral consultants as considered so by leading pediatric neurologists and developmental pediatricians in L.A. and Orange County. It's a real pleasure to welcome Melissa Reiner to Sirius XM Insight.
Hi, John. Sorry I sound like this. I'm just getting over the flu. I know I better than this, but I'm really honored to be on your show.
No worries. Let's just say this conversation on autism will sound a bit more sultry than other conversations might. And I'll go easy on you. Thank you. Congratulations on the acclaim for your work on The Good Doctor. And I really do appreciate all you've done to educate the public about something that, well, let's be honest, there's a lot of misinformation about there and a lot of fear guiding people's choices and feelings rather than reason.
Yeah, I think it's really compelling because with, I think, the growing number in diagnoses, the so-called general population is shrinking to some degree. And what's interesting, I think, about The Good Doctor is I think typically autism has been portrayed in the media in a much more familial sort of arena for the people closest to them at school, at home. And here it's in the workplace and it's out in the world. And I think with this growing number of individuals who are now in the workforce, they are doctors, there are accountants, there are teachers, there are, every individual is really sort of expanding their horizon. And as more and more individuals in the so-called general population are encountering more and more individuals with autism in the workforce and in the world, I think it's imperative that we really embrace and understand the value of learning how to communicate effectively and productively with everyone, so that we're all connecting and communicating and collaborating in a really viable and meaningful way.
I couldn't agree more. And it seems that due to the advocacy of so many folks like yourself and so many parents and organizations, autism is becoming close to becoming a protected minority class in school districts throughout the country. Parents were tired of of paying taxes for school services that did not apply to their kids with ASD. And you're seeing more and more programs inspired by ABA therapy popping up. And more, the society is making room for children born on the spectrum. And you have said your goal is for children with autism to become adults who lead productive, independent lives. Do you feel that we've made real strides in that goal in the past decade?
Unfortunately, I think with the new administration, we've seen a lot of cuts in funding for services for children. It doesn't feel in the autism world and for parents with children with special needs like it feels often like we have to fight really hard to either obtain services or to maintain and sustain them. And it feels like it's always a fight. And like I said, there are more and more cuts to funding all over for services, and that obviously has a direct and profound effect on our children.
Well, you work as a consultant on autism on The Good Doctor, and I mentioned some of the shows earlier that have been focusing a lot on ASD, and Sesame Street, of course, is doing great work on it. But how do you feel the media is handling the subject of autism as opposed to how they might have tried to tackle it half a generation ago?
Well, I think, everyone's go-to is Rain Man, and I think obviously we've come a long way. And I think that there's been a real natural evolution. And seeing, Dr. Sean Murphy be a very successful and insightful, not just doctor, but human. He's completely endearing and likable and watchable, and everyone's rooting for him. And I feel like, I think there's a real trend to releasing that stigma. And I feel there, like I said, I don't know anyone who doesn't know someone on the spectrum.
Right.
I really don't.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like I'm saying, we really want to bridge that gap, because I think it's shrinking so drastically and so quickly. So if everyone knows someone, I think this sort of ability to connect in a meaningful way. One of the crux of the work I do centers around shifting our communication style.
Yes, your organization, bridgingpathways.com, really centers on the shift in communication style. I'm wondering if you can break that phrase down for us.
Yeah, so what most parents and adults, just without any thought, typically speak in imperatives and interrogatives. Almost everything is a command or a question. It's how we talk to most kids. And it's pretty much, I have 3 little kids of my own, and it's how we talk, right? It's how teachers talk to students. Come to the desk, or come to the table, or brush your teeth, or where's your backpack, right? And so it's just sort of how we speak. But when we do that, we unwittingly see a spike. We create a spike, rather, of heart rate and blood pressure, which is really similar to an anxiety response. Mm. And for most kids, it doesn't have a huge negative impact. But for individuals on the spectrum in particular, and really for all people in general, because it works in a whole classroom for everyone, it works for in-laws, it works for neighbors. But when we speak declaratively instead, we don't see that same spike in heart rate and blood pressure. So we don't see that, as tantamount to an anxiety response. And when we speak declaratively, it's processed differently in the brain. And it ends up being a more effective form of communication that really yields positive results. So I had worked with a little child, and he was very verbal, but he would only talk about what his perseveration focus was. So he only talked about World War II and battleships and things like that, and that was regardless of anyone's glazed expression. And if he wasn't talking about something that inspired him, initiated by him, then he really typically wouldn't speak. And I was new to this is many years ago, and I was new to this sort of shift in communication style. And I was sitting with him in his backyard, and we heard a dog bark in the neighbor's yard. And I said, "Oh, is that your neighbor's dog?" And he was silent. And then I thought, okay, I'm going to try this, Melissa, let's do it. And I said, "That sounds like a big dog." And he paused, and I paused. And he said, "It is. His name is Barney, and he drools a lot." And suddenly we were engaged in a conversation that never otherwise would have occurred. I
see. So you didn't ask a question about the barking. Right. You spoke in a declarative way and made a statement that he could respond to.
Yes, it's fascinating, and it's remarkable. And so, and even in the show, in The Good Doctor, the writers and I work closely with one another to make sure that we're sort of presenting an authentic individual with autism. And one of the scenes, and Tonya, the woman who plays Dr. Claire Brown, is sort of asking questions, and Dr. Melendez is asking him questions, and he's not answering. He's in sort of a heightened state anyway because of stress and anxiety, because he wasn't allowed into the hospital anyway. regardless, she sort of stumbles upon this ability to connect with him when she stops asking questions and instead just simply states, I don't know why you wanted us to do an echocardiogram. And then he answers. And it's not all the time, and it doesn't have to be 100% of the time, but when we do shift our communication style, what it affords is our children and individuals, it affords them an opportunity to sort of apprentice their brains and think about how to think. So when we do that, we have this moment of discovery. And in that moment of discovery, John, we're literally building neuronal pathways in our brain. We're rewiring our brain.
Right.
It's so exciting to me.
Absolutely. I mean, it is a form of neuroplasticity, and you can rewire your own brain. But this is fascinating to me. So, in other words, because individuals with autism often have levels of anxiety, the belief is that when a question is asked, which is how most people communicate, it can spike someone's anxiety rates. And then by just making it a more declarative sentence that they're not obliged to respond to, it allows them to respond with less pressure, and communication flows more freely.
Absolutely. And it is pretty remarkable, and it's always exciting to me and astonishing to me how well this works. And it's beautiful, like I said, where this child that I was with, I would never have had a conversation. It would have just been, and you can imagine for a parent how frustrating, how disappointing, how challenging it would be to not be able to not know how, to not be equipped with the tools to connect with your own child. And then when you sort of find this way, it opens up doors and a whole world.
It's so inspiring. If you're just joining us, we're talking with Melissa Reiner, who is hailed as Hollywood's autism consultant for her work on The Good Doctor. And we're taking your calls at 877-974-7487. That is 877-9-SIRIUS. I love this whole notion that that by the declarative sentences will induce less stress. I would imagine this applies to adults with autism as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's for all individuals. And I work with many adults in my practice, and there are these same challenges. I actually work with a gentleman who's at the VA hospital in LA, and he is often very challenged to connect. And what's fascinating is when people are sort of, when he's under this sort of barrage of questions from his peers, and he's a 48-year-old man, he gets so concerned about giving the right answer, and his anxiety spikes. And so he'll often just shut down, which can also infuriate his peer group further.
Right.
And so it's this terrible cycle. And when instead we're able to sort of go into the workplace as an advocate, which I do sometimes, and talk to individuals who work with him directly, and just offer this support and offer these options and let them know that there are alternatives to successfully connect. And that's all I think. I mean, I feel like the reason why we're on the planet is to connect, meaning to feel heard,
Yes.
And so everyone in that cycle is not feeling heard. Everyone is affected by it. And if we can find a way through this shift in communication to connect in a real way that helps us to bridge that gap and helps us to connect successfully with one another, then it's triumphant.
How much has the rise of ABA behavioral therapy changed the game in the last couple of years?
So I'm not an ABA therapist or provider, but and I think it has tremendous value. However, often people come to me after sometimes those therapies have stagnated because the work that I'm doing is really more nuanced. And it's really more centered around the individuals and their interactions with their social dynamics. Mm-hmm. So it's less about looking like someone's attending and much more about really attending.
Right.
In that meaningful way. So, I worked with a young boy who didn't know the difference, for example, between thank you, sorry, and you're welcome, because someone always said, say sorry, say thank you, say you're welcome.
Right.
It was meaningless to him. He didn't know that. So if someone handed him something that he wanted, he would try to figure out which one would fit, and he would say, I'm sorry. But really it was thank you. And so I want to really cultivate from an internal desire to connect in an appropriate and meaningful way, rather than sort of superimpose externally from the outside in. So if I tell someone over, you know what it's like, John? It's like when we follow our navigation system, and they tell you where to go, and you're sort of being schlepped along, and you go, oh, I'm here. And I drive like 3,000 miles a month for my practice. And so sometimes I literally don't know what city I'm in. I just showed up at their door. And I don't really have to engage my brain when I'm following this navigation system. But, you know, or when back in the day before there were navigation systems, when you would follow someone to a party, and then you'd want to get home, and you're like, well, I'm ready to go home, and your friend wasn't, and you're like, I have no idea how to get home.
Yeah.
So we want individuals with autism. We want individuals in society. We want individuals in this world to be looking at their own map and navigating through their own system so that they can devise their own path in appropriate and meaningful and profound ways. Because otherwise we're just being schlepped along.
I want to take a couple calls from our listeners, but first, really quick, I do want to ask, one of the approach Bridging Pathways takes is something called Relationship Development Intervention, or RDI. What is that program all about?
So that's where I first had my training, and it's a brilliantly designed methodology that is where this has centered. So the whole idea of apprenticing someone's brain and the whole idea of shifting this communication style, that's where I learned. That's where I learned about this, and it's also with, Vygotsky, and it's not new, but it's how it was sort of packaged so that we can apply it in this really important way. But that's where my training was, through RDI.
Ah, brilliant. Bill is calling from the great state of Wyoming. He works with autistic students. Bill, welcome. You're on Sirius XM Insight with Melissa Reiner.
Hi.
Thanks for taking the call. I'm a paleontologist, and I work at a small museum in Wyoming, dinosaurs. We lead dinosaur digs with families and kids. And as you can imagine, we get an awful lot of students who, I guess the older term was Asperger's syndrome. We get a lot of autistic students who come to work with us with their family. And a moment ago, you were talking about declarative sentences. And when we're interacting with the families, we want to make sure the kids enjoy themselves and have fun. And there always seems to be a crisis between what we're asking the students or the kids, what's your favorite dinosaur? What do you like to do? That kind of stuff. And there seems to be a crisis in that. When you talk about declarative sentences, what can I do to make sure the kids are enjoying themselves and interact with them?
Great question.
Yeah, so I always think of them as I statements, or stating what you see. So if I don't know your full capacity in working with students and the kids and their families, but if you're alongside a child and you're both looking and sharing a view of, let's say, two different dinosaurs, and you would simply say, I like the gray one. It kind of looks like he's smiling. And then you just pause and wait and create space so that the child might then respond. They may not, but the likelihood increases astronomically, exponentially, so that child might then be able to say, I like the brown one because he has the spikes on his back.
So rather than ask a question which could stress a child out or cause anxiety due to any number of circumstances, just stating the obvious, stating your feelings or thoughts or facts to see if that stimulates conversation rather than requiring an answer from someone.
Yes, and you can share your thoughts out loud. So you might say, I'm in love with the Brontosaurus because she was a vegetarian or whatever it is. And then it can open the path and the door, like you said, John, for further communication and interaction.
Bill?
So space, giving them space to answer. And just out of curiosity, I mean, some of the best paleontologists in the country are autistic. I'm not sure. It's one of those things. It's one of the sciences that attract a lot of, in my experience.
Mm-hmm.
I've worked with grad students. I've worked with professors, and they're on the spectrum. Some of them are prolific. They write a lot. And when you get them started, they'll literally chew your ear off when it comes to what they know about a subject.
Mm-hmm.
Now, with the kids and the students, when they start talking, is there a way? How do you politely and nicely bring them back? You know, they're telling you what they know and what they've gotten out of the last couple of dinosaur books they've read. And you're trying to okay, well, now we have to get, the down and dirty, and you have to start digging, and this is how we do this, and, hands-on parts.
So I always...
Not at all. It's a great question.
Yeah, it's great. I like to certainly thank someone who has, a vast understanding of something for sharing, and I'll interject and I'll say I'm really so excited about what you're saying, and I'm so grateful that you're sharing it with me. I'm ready to talk about this. And I was looking over here at the dig, and I'm ready to use this brush or whatever tool. I'm not a paleontologist myself, it turns out. So, and that way you just sort of step in to their world that they are sharing and thank them politely, because it is wonderful, and then simply transfer that sort of next step to take them to now what you're interested in as well. It's a shared experience. Nice. And it helps to frame that for an individual.
Bill.
So one last question before I forget. Are they more comfortable with being told what to do or asked to do something? I mean, I'm not trying to pressure them or anything like that.
Yeah, for the students that I work with and for individuals on the spectrum, I find that asking questions really does sort of mimic or help to create a little bit of an anxiety response. So I tend to really avoid that if possible. And it doesn't mean that the alternative is to tell them what to do. Like I said, it's really a lot of sharing your thoughts and ideas. If you talk about what you're sort of talking out loud, if you talk about what you like, what excites you in the museum, what is thrilling and filled with wonder for you, and that will help sort of spotlight for them, for individuals who are seeking, information that you're giving, to then what we would say sort of co-regulate, or they would have shared or joint attention with you.
If I may then, Bill, if I could jump in, Melissa, a question then. In terms of requesting a child to do something in this situation, would it be better to say, please go do this thing, rather than to make it a request saying, can you please go do this? But to make it a declarative request rather than an inquisitive request. Instead of saying, can you please go sit over there, please go sit over there.
Well, please would be what we call a tricky imperative. It sounds like it's declarative, but it's really a command.
Oh.
So I would just say, I'm ready to come sit over here. I'm sitting over here now, so I can have a great view of the movie we're about to start or whatever. And so when I start with an I statement, I really decrease the risk and chance of employing those tricky imperatives and interrogatives. So I really sort of think out loud, talk out loud about my thoughts and my feelings, so that, like I said, we can apprentice one another's brains, and then we can share our attention in a really meaningful way.
Bill, thank you again so much for your call.
The most useful response I've gotten, honestly, in 10 years.
Wow. Well, listen,
thank you.
Go check out bridgingpathways.com, Melissa's organization, to learn even more. Thank you so much. What great questions. And those kids are really lucky to work with a guy like you. Thank you, Bill, because it certainly is an inspiring story. And I guess inspiring stories are really what we need right now, Melissa, when it comes to this. And it seems to be what you guys are all about in terms of building neuronal pathways, dynamic intelligence, and just building greater communication and success skills for folks. It does seem that, a generation from now, autism will not have the stigma it did a generation ago.
Absolutely. And I think you were talking about the fear that people have. And I think when everyone feels equipped with a skill set and the ability to know that a simple shift in communication, it's sort of 180-degree shift. It's pretty Herculean. But with just a simple shift in communication, we can affect change. We can communicate effectively. It eradicates the fear. There's no room for it. And there's no place for it anymore, because now we all are equipped and have tools to really navigate together towards a successful interaction.
It's such a pleasure to speak with you, Melissa, and I do hope you'll join us sometime in studio in person when you're in New York. Thank you very much for doing this in spite of having a sore throat and your voice being impacted. What's the best way for folks to follow your work and learn more?
They can go to bridgingpathways.com and check me out there. I'm really grateful for all of your kindness.
Thank you so much.
Grateful. Thank you.
What a pleasure. Thank you. When we come back, we're going to shift gears completely yet again and talk about politics with the great Midwin Charles, legal analyst for CNN and MSNBC. You don't want to miss it. 877-9-SIRIUS. Forgive me, Cheryl. We'll be right back.